Decided to go with Hannah's favorite chocolate cake. You loved chocolate, didn't you? Mom, eating that will kill you. My daughter Grace quickly swapped the cakes between my husband Ian and me. I nervously took a bite of the cake. Grace started eating her cake too. Ian began boasting about how he had to reserve this cake a month in advance and how delicious the crushed nuts on top were, when suddenly he began to struggle. Ian's face turned red rapidly. He started to gasp for air, frothed at the mouth, trembled, and then collapsed on the floor. My name is Hannah. I'm 36 years old and work at a food inspection company. I live with my husband Ian, who is 2 years older than me, and our 7-year-old daughter, Grace. Ian and I were college circle friends, started dating after we both found jobs, and got married 2 years later. Grace was born the following year. Grace was slow to develop, starting to walk at the age of 2. We were very worried and took her to various hospitals, but there was nothing particularly wrong. Every hospital said, "There are individual differences, so let's see how it goes." Ian, who was terribly worried at first, lost patience with Grace, who never spoke nor walked, and stopped paying attention to her. My mother-in-law Isabella labeled Grace as disabled, despised her, and never held her. Only my father-in-law Jonathan doted on her, often smiling and saying she was a unique and wonderful child, which made me very happy. Ian, who had been very kind until we got married, became moody at home due to Grace's situation. If something didn't please him, he would bang the table, stomp on the floor, and make a lot of noise. Each time, I would shrink in fear. Ian's behavior at home stressed me out, leading to irregular periods and eventually early menopause, making it impossible for me to have more children. At that time, I cried under the comforter. Afterward, Ian became more aggressive towards me, complaining about the way I cleaned, the seasoning of food, and how I folded laundry. Every time he complained, he banged the table hard or placed cups roughly, so I was scared and could only apologize. However, Grace would watch Ian's tantrums with a curious face, never crying out of fear. Ian looked at Grace as if she were something creepy. Grace didn't talk much, but learned letters quickly, and was always reading books. She had an incredible concentration, and would read for hours. Engrossed in encyclopedias and children's books instead of picture books, and seemed to understand a fair amount of kanji by the time she was in senior kindergarten. When it was time for Grace to start elementary school, her lack of speech raised concerns about developmental disorders, and she was recommended for a special education class. When I discussed this with Ian, he exploded in anger. "Don't be ridiculous. Why should my child go to a special school?" Ian slammed a cup onto the table. I flinched and could only shrink back. "Anyway, you figure it out. I won't accept anything that looks bad socially," Ian said and stormed off to the bedroom. As I was holding my head, Grace came over and patted my back with her small hands. "Thank you," I said, hugging Grace as I cried. "Grace, it's not your fault." The next day, I got a call from Isabella. "Are you really going to send my granddaughter to such a class? If the neighbors find out, I'll be too embarrassed to walk outside. It'll all be your fault." Isabella said, then hung up after saying her piece. Neither Ian nor Isabella really worried about Grace. They were only concerned about how they were perceived. After consulting with local counselors, school teachers, and municipal employees, Grace was able to attend regular classes instead of special education. I thought the special education class, its students, parents, and teachers were all wonderful and would have been a good fit for Grace. But knowing Ian and Isabella's opposition, I couldn't bring myself to suggest it. When Grace started elementary school and I had more time, the company where I worked as a temporary employee offered me a permanent position. The job was enjoyable and fulfilling. Compared to the stifling atmosphere at home, I was thrilled to be relied upon and needed. I took a leap and discussed it with Ian. As expected, Ian was hesitant. "I've been offered a full-time position at my current company. I really want to work there as a full-time employee." Ian crossed his arms with a look of disdain. "Make sure you take care of the house, just like before, or even better." "But I'll need help from you too." Ian glared and slammed the table. "Housework is the wife's job. Asking me is totally missing the mark." After a bit of thought, Ian smirked. "Got it. I'll ask Mom. She can take care of the house." I was shocked. Could I really endure having Isabella, with whom I do not get along, come to our house? Eventually, Ian gave Isabella a key, and she started coming over every other day. When Isabella came over, it was a parade of sarcasm. "The cleaning is not done at all. Poor Ian. How were you raised to clean like this?" Because of Isabella's visits, I was even more meticulous with the housework. Yet, she deliberately focused on insignificant details to complain about. I endured this bullying for weeks, but finally couldn't take it anymore and told Isabella she didn't need to come over because I would take care of the house properly. Isabella reluctantly agreed and stopped coming. Just when I felt relieved, Ian started to spend more time at his parents' house. Ian had always loved his parents' house and frequently returned there, but now he did so even more often. Then, when Grace was in the second grade, the lively Jonathan suddenly passed away. Jonathan was the only one who was kind to Grace. What puzzled me at the funeral was seeing Ian and Isabella occasionally exchanging glances and laughing. Didn't they feel sad? Surely Jonathan and Isabella were not close, but laughing at a funeral felt out of place. With Jonathan gone, Grace lost the only ally she had around her. I was beside myself with worry. I had been giving my all to housework, childcare, and my job, but perhaps due to overexertion, I fell ill with a fever. I tried calling Ian, who was practically living at his in-laws', to ask for help with meals, but he coldly refused. "Mom never made Dad do anything, even when she was sick. I don't want to catch whatever you have. I'll stay at my parents' house for a while." With that, Ian hung up, and didn't return home for a week. As my health recovered and work got busier, I was approached with a promotion. I was offered the position of a manager. I was happy, but the truth was, considering my family situation, it felt like a heavy burden. I discussed it with Ian, but as expected, he insisted on me properly managing the housework. Moreover, Ian glanced at me with a mocking look. "However, I wonder if someone like you can handle being a manager. That would make you equal to me in terms of title." Ian left the room and headed to the bedroom. The next day, Isabella came to our house. "Ian has been complaining. You're not focusing enough on the housework, and the house is a mess," she said. Isabella hurriedly entered our house and began inspecting everything. The way I wiped the windows, folded the laundry, and the water stains in the bathroom. I was made to redo all of these. After several visits from Isabella, and her starting to complain to me, Grace began to speak up to Isabella. Grace approached Isabella with a serious look and asked, "Grandma, what do you think are the 4 main components of happiness? What's the happiness hormone?" Isabella was taken aback by Grace's barrage of questions. It must have been a while since Isabella heard Grace's voice. "You can speak normally, huh?" "Answer my previous questions." Isabella, likely not understanding the questions, tilted her head. "Oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, endorphins." Isabella looked even more confused and anxiously turned to me. They are neurotransmitters, mainly secreted by the pituitary gland in the brain. Grace has been reading medical books lately. While Isabella was astonished, she listened to Grace's explanation. Grace continued to passionately discuss neurotransmitters, their relation to diseases, and sleep substances. Isabella, overwhelmed by Grace's focus, went home looking exhausted. Thanks to that, I spent the day without any nagging. On my birthday, Ian, returning from a business trip, bought a birthday cake. It was the first time I received anything from Ian since we got married. Despite giving Isabella souvenirs from his trips and branded scarves, wallets, and bags for her birthday, he had never bought anything for me and Grace. I was surprised by Ian's sudden gesture. As I stood there, stunned, Ian held up the cake box. "Thanks for everything. I love you. I'll put it in the fridge. Let's eat it later." Ian's exaggerated tone gave me goosebumps. Grace, seemingly displeased by something, took a bottle of mineral water from the fridge, glanced at the cake, and went to her room. Since Grace stayed in her room, we had dinner without her. Throughout the meal, Ian kept smiling and continued with his overdone lines. "I always leave everything to you. I'm sorry. I'll start helping out a little bit more." Thanks." I found Ian's words creepy, but didn't want to upset him, so I just nodded along. After we finished eating and I was cleaning up, Ian took the cake box out of the fridge. As I was about to get plates and knives, Ian gestured for me to sit down. "Let me handle this." Ian served the cake on plates and brought it to the table. Honestly, I was creeped out by Ian's actions. "The cake is Santa's favorite chocolate cake. You loved chocolate, didn't you?" Unable to bear being alone with him any longer, I decided to call Grace. "I'll go get Grace. Wait a moment." I hurried to Grace's room. Grace was researching something on an old computer I no longer used. "Mom, you shouldn't eat that cake." What do you mean?" "Just trust me for now." Grace looked at me with desperate eyes. It was the first time I saw such a distressed expression on Grace's face. Regardless, I decided to trust Grace. Together, we went back to the living room. "Shall we eat then?" "Hey, there are no forks." Normally, I would head straight to the kitchen, but Grace was holding onto my clothes tightly, preventing me from moving. "Oops, forgot about that. I'll get them now." Ian cheerfully stood up from the table. Then Grace whispered to me, "Mom, you'll die if you eat that." Grace quickly swapped the cakes between me and Ian. Ian, returning with the forks, began to eat the cake in front of him. "This is delicious, Hannah. You should try it too. It's made by a famous pastry chef." I nervously took a bite of the cake. Grace also started eating her cake. As Ian boasted about reserving the cake a month in advance and how delicious the crushed walnuts on top were, he suddenly began to suffer. Ian's face quickly turned red. He struggled to breathe, foamed at the mouth, trembled, and then collapsed on the floor. It looked like an allergic anaphylactic shock. Both Ian and I have a peanut allergy, but we were eating cake, which shouldn't contain any peanuts. Confused and frozen, Grace calmly spoke to me. "Mom, call an ambulance." Grace handed me the mobile phone. I snapped back to reality and called an ambulance. Grace turned Ian on his side and asked me to hit his back hard. I did as told, and Ian spit out the cake he had eaten. Then he seemed to breathe a bit easier. Ian was mumbling, "Peanuts, peanuts," as if in a daze. He continued to mutter in the ambulance. After receiving treatment at the hospital, Ian's life was saved. He was kept in the hospital for a few days, just to be safe. Why did Grace know something life-threatening was going to happen? I wondered as I completed the hospital admission procedures and headed home. As soon as we got home, Grace showed me a snack wrapper she had taken out of the trash. "This. Dad threw it in the kitchen trash." It was the wrapper of a cookie made with peanuts. Grace continued to explain. The cake box Dad bought had its seal half peeled off. She saw a snack wrapper in the kitchen trash can that she didn't recognize, so she looked it up online. She discovered the snack contained peanuts and warned me. I still can't believe the crushed walnuts on the cake were actually crushed peanut cookies. I shuddered, remembering Grace's warning. "Mom, you'll die if you eat that." If Grace hadn't been so quick-witted, I might have been the one in the ambulance bed. The thought of myself lying there, possibly because Ian tampered with the cake to take my life, sent chills down my spine. I took out my mobile phone, intending to call the police. We have to tell the police right away. I think it's better if we don't. Grace interjected. "Why not?" Grace began to explain calmly. "It was Dad who collapsed. If we tell the police, Mom might end up being accused." My vision darkened at Grace's words. Indeed, she was right. Going to the police might just make me a suspect. Feeling desperate, I didn't know what to do. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll figure something out." Grace went into Ian's study and started searching for something. Ian had always said not to enter his study, and I rarely did. Grace opened a drawer and flipped through a notebook. Dad's meticulous, so he must have left something written down. Grace stopped flipping and showed me the notebook. It contained shocking information. Jonathan had fallen victim to a similar scheme. The notebook mentioned peanut cookies, crushed into a pinch, mixed in the sauce. Even more terrifying, Isabella was involved in the plan. They had conspired together. The last page read, "Next is Hannah's birthday." I clenched the notebook tightly. "It's okay," Grace said, trying to reassure me. At that moment, I realized I was trembling with anger rather than fear. The thought of them going after me, after Jonathan, I swore in my heart, Ian and Isabella will not get away with this. I resolved quietly to Grace, "This notebook will serve as evidence, right?" Grace shook her head sadly. "Unfortunately, it won't," she continued. "They could just say it was all fantasy. Besides, Grandpa is just bones now. There's no way to prove anything." I looked down, deep in thought. You're right. Without evidence, they can easily deny everything. Grace gripped my hand tightly. "I'll find the evidence. I'll protect you, Mom. Let's send those two to prison." Encouraged by Grace's words, I nodded firmly and squeezed her hand back. If they're up for it, so are we. For Grace, I resolved to protect my life and avenge Jonathan. Grace and I vowed revenge on Ian and Isabella. We began preparing for our final battle. First, we needed to lure them in. I called Isabella, asking for Ian's favorite dishes to cook for him when he returned from the hospital. Isabella came over without suspicion. Though I despised every second of being with Isabella, I endured it and learned the recipes in the kitchen. Meanwhile, Grace searched Isabella's bag and found the peanut cookies. Quickly, she took one out. The next day, I took the peanut cookie to work and requested a component analysis. I never thought working at a food inspection company would come in handy like this. A few days later, Ian was discharged. I told Isabella I was preparing a celebration for Ian's recovery and asked her to pick him up. While Ian was being discharged, Grace and I prepared his favorite dishes and waited for them. When the preparations for the celebration were complete, Ian returned with Isabella. Grace went to the entrance to welcome them. Grace, holding Ian's luggage, led them to the table. Today's dishes were taught by Grandma, and we cooked them together. Ian happily took his seat at the table and began eating. Isabella, too, seemed to enjoy the food. After a while, puzzled expressions appeared on their faces. Mom?" Ian whispered to Isabella, making a sign with his eyes. "No way." Isabella, looking at something on the table, widened her eyes in shock. She was so surprised that she dropped her fork and didn't even realize it. Ian and Isabella didn't touch their food anymore. I deliberately spoke to Ian. "Is the seasoning okay? I guess I can't make it as well as Isabella does." They muttered, looking down. "No, it's not like that. It's delicious." I smiled as much as I could at them. "This sauce is not just tasty, it also seems to boost energy. I learned it from Jonathan before." Ian and Isabella started shivering as if they were cold. I kept smiling without concern. "Grace, pour this sauce on their meals." Grace reached for the sauce. "Stop! Don't put such nonsense in!" Ian exclaimed, pushing Grace's hand away with a terrified expression. "Why so scared? I want you and Isabella to live long." I offered my best smile. "Stop it, please!" Isabella screamed, covering her ears. "Why? You wanted me to stay healthy too, right? That's why you poured it on the cake. But in the end, you were the one who ended up being taken away in an ambulance." I presented them with documents, pretending to be surprised. I had our company's inspectors analyze the components. The stuff on the cake matched the peanut cookies. Ian and Isabella looked at each other, confronted with evidence. "What are you talking about? I don't know anything about that." "The peanut cookies Isabella had and the ones you threw in our trash are from the same product." "Are you thinking it's okay to just open someone's belongings? Besides, that cookie was a souvenir from a friend." I calmly placed a copy of Ian's notebook on the table. "Then, what about this part here, saying, 'Bought the cookies online'?" The notebook detailed the manufacturer, product name, shipment date, and price. Ian and Isabella's faces turned red, then pale. "Also, if only a small amount is ingested, inducing vomiting might not detect it," is written here. I stared hard at Isabella. This has to do with Jonathan's cause of death, doesn't it? Ian, looking defeated, began to speak. Dad was in the way. Maybe he didn't like how close Mom and I were, always interfering and being annoying. Yes, he kept lecturing us, saying, "You two are strange, not a proper parent-child relationship." I couldn't stand it. We mixed peanut powder into the sauce and fed it to him. Jonathan was just concerned about the unhealthy relationship between a mama's boy and his overly attached mother. Ian and Isabella resented him for it. Their reasoning was selfish beyond belief. I couldn't help but feel sorry for Jonathan, who tried to create a healthy family environment and lost his life for it. So you used the same method on me because it worked on Jonathan. That's right. You have the same peanut allergy as Dad and me. You were in the way too. I was beyond anger, utterly dumbfounded. What you've done is a crime. I'm going to call the police now and submit the evidence. Ian suddenly stood up, grabbed the copy of the notebook from the table, crumpled it, and forced it into his mouth, swallowing it. Isabella, Grace, and I were shocked and stared at Ian. Now the evidence is gone. The police will just think it's Hannah's delusional story, Ian said triumphantly, looking down on me and Grace. Dad, that's a copy. The original is in a different place, Grace calmly stated. Then she placed the voice recorder on the table. Now you can't escape. Grace had placed the voice recorder under the table and had been recording from the start. It's over now. Ian slumped into his chair, powerless. We were so close. Just a little more and the nuisance would have been gone. Isabella seemed unable to contain her anger, banging the table with both hands. Dad and Grandmom really thought they could get away with such a plan, Grace said with disbelief. No matter what the plan was, I would always protect Mom. I took out my mobile phone. I'm calling the police. Please calmly accept your punishment. That's the least you can do for Jonathan. As I was about to use my phone, Ian and Isabella began to apologize. Sorry, okay? Please, no police. We mean it. We're sorry. Please, forgive us. We didn't mean it. Ian and Isabella were desperately apologizing. Suddenly, Grace started explaining their method of crime. Dad is a mama's boy who can't leave his mom, so a perfect crime was impossible. First of all, leaving too much evidence. If it were me, I would. I quickly covered Grace's mouth. Grace, please use your knowledge wisely. I looked into Grace's eyes. Grace also looked back. Okay, I understand. I'll stay away from such people from now on. And later, I have something to report to Mom. I hugged Grace tightly. Alright, from now on, let's live peacefully. Just the two of us. As the police took Ian and Isabella away, they were screaming and crying, causing the officers trouble. The copy of the notebook, the voice recorder's audio, and the purchase history of the peanut cookies on Ian's computer served as evidence, leading to their conviction for Jonathan's case as well. After the arrest, my divorce from Ian was finalized. I received $30,000 from Ian and Isabella each as alimony. Isabella sold the in-laws' house to make the payments. Ian, having no income for child support, used the money from selling their house. Now, Ian and Isabella had no place to return upon release. I used part of the alimony to create a grave for Jonathan. I wanted to give him a proper send-off. After Ian and Isabella's verdict, Grace and I reported everything to Jonathan's grave. Surely, Jonathan would be happy for us in heaven. Later, Grace showed me a piece of paper. This is what I wanted to report earlier. It was the result of an IQ test. I was shocked and looked twice. It says 135 here. My IQ is 135. I was amazed. An IQ above 130 is considered gifted. Sorry for taking the test without telling you, Mom. I also used your credit card without asking. I was once again surprised by what Grace could do. Grace then transferred to a school that accommodated gifted students. Although Grace still struggled with communication and didn't talk to anyone, she enjoyed the environment where she could study her interests as much as she liked. Life with just Grace and me was enjoyable, and I found fulfillment in my work. People often said I looked younger since life had become more vibrant and my complexion improved. After we started living together, Grace began hugging me more often. Hugging releases a lot of the happiness hormone, oxytocin. I'm still not sure where oxytocin comes from, but it definitely makes me happy. And to my surprise, my menstrual cycle returned. Maybe it's thanks to the happiness hormone Grace mentioned. From now on, we'll continue to live with smiles,